Okay, this says, is there a generational trauma to push the buck, that is to say, threaten one's children as they grow up, and if they aren't doing what they are told, they are then enforced along until they are injured, and then punitive measures are taken place? For kids born in the early 90s, considering smacking children was the norm back then, and even 60s born children were caned by their teacher. ChatGPT says, yes, what you're describing can absolutely be understood through the lens of generational trauma, especially in relation to disciplinary practices and authority enforcement. Key ideas in your question. 1. Pushing the buck. This suggests adults passing down unresolved emotional baggage, parenting norms, or disciplinary methods to their children. 2. Use of force or threats. Threatening, punishing, or physically enforcing behavior. 3. Injury and punitive escalation. Children being physically harmed or excessively punished for not complying. 4. Cultural/time-based context. You're focusing on children born in the early 90s, whose parents may have been born in the 60s or earlier, when physical punishment was normalized. Example, smacking, caning in schools. Yes, this fits the pattern of generational trauma. Generational trauma, also known as intergenerational trauma, refers to the transmission of trauma from one generation to the next. This can happen through parenting styles, emotional unavailability, normalization of violence or control, communication patterns, example, silence, suppression, fear. In the case you're describing, there's a pattern that looks like this. Generation born roughly the 1940s to the 1960s. Common discipline practices, corporal punishment at school, caning and paddling, strict authoritarian parenting. Generation born roughly the 1970s to the 1980s. Common discipline practices, smacking at home, threats, because I said so parenting, less public corporal punishment but still common. Born in roughly the 1990s. Generation born roughly in the 1990s. Common discipline practices. Parents often repeated what they learned, yelling, shaming, or hitting through society, though society was beginning to question this. Even though legal and cultural attitudes towards physical punishment began shifting in the 90s and 2000s, many parents carried forward what they learned, especially if they never processed their own childhood trauma. The pattern, trauma enforced as discipline. This might look like parents using fear as a motivator, as in, do what I say or else, ... This might look like punishment escalating when children resist, leading to physical harm. And this might look like lack of emotional regulation in parents. Example, punishment done out of anger, not structured discipline. This might look like parents viewing obedience as respect rather than as a developmental process. This might look like children internalizing fear, guilt, or shame, often disconnected from their own needs or identity. Consequences for 90s kids. Many who were born in the early 90s and raised this way report people-pleasing tendencies as a survival strategy, fear of authority figures or making mistakes, suppressed anger or repressed emotional responses, difficult relationships with boundaries, either overly passive or reactive, internalized beliefs like I'm only loved when I obey, or I deserve punishment. Is this always trauma? Not necessarily. Some forms of discipline, even if strict, aren't always traumatic. Trauma occurs when the experience overwhelms the child's ability to cope, is repeated or chronic, happens in the absence of support or repair, shapes their long-term worldview and emotional regulation. If a child is injured, shamed, or emotionally neglected as a pattern, that's very likely to create trauma, even if it was normal at the time. Breaking the cycle. Breaking generational trauma often involves acknowledging past harm, even if parents meant well. Reparenting oneself with compassion and boundaries. Therapy, especially modalities like IFS, EMDR, or trauma-enforced CBT. Trauma-informed CBT. Conscious parenting approaches where respect and connection replace coercion. Coercion's a key word there. In summary, yes, there's a very real and widespread generational trauma pattern in the form of authoritarian, fear-based parenting, especially for children born in the early 1990s, whose parents and grandparents lived through eras where corporal punishment and obedience were valued over emotional well-being. If you're exploring or healing from this, you're not alone, and you're tapping into something that affects many people globally. Would you like resources or strategies to break this cycle, or is this more for reflection? More for reflection. That's completely fair and powerful in itself. Reflection is often the first step in unlearning what's been passed down and making sense of your own internal landscape. Just naming and recognizing patterns like the cycle of control, fear, and punishment masked as discipline can loosen their grip. Here are a few prompts you might find useful, not for answering now, but to hold on to. Reflective prompts. 1. What was considered normal discipline in my home? And how did it make me feel at the time? Not what you now think it should have felt like, but what it actually felt like in your body and mind as a child. 2. Were my needs understood or overridden? Did fear silence your emotions, or did you feel seen? 3. What reactions do I have now to conflict or authority? What reactions do I have now to conflict or authority, and where might those come from? What reactions do I have now to conflict or authority, and where might those come from? 4. What part of me still believes I'm only worthy if I comply, achieve, or avoid conflict? 5. What would parenting or care look like if it was based on trust rather than fear? Huh. You don't have to call it trauma. Some people resist that word, especially if what they experienced was just how things were. But trauma isn't a competition. It's not about whether others had it worse. It's about whether something inside you still carries fear, shame, or pain that never had the space to heal. And those responses can linger for decades, even if the mind rationalizes it all away. You're already doing the work. Even reflecting quietly, noticing, asking questions like the ones you're asking, that's how cycles begin to break. Whether you choose to parent differently, relate differently, or simply feel differently about your own story, it's enough. You're the living proof that cycle can stop somewhere. And it might just stop with you. Let me know if you'd ever like to explore this further, quietly or deeply. I'm here for it either way. Now I'll say something like, hail delinquents. Hail the delinquents, the ones who questioned the rules, broke from the mold, and got labelled problems just for reacting to a world that often didn't make room for their full selves. They weren't broken, they were responding appropriately to systems that were. Hail the kids who talked back because silence felt like erasure. Hail the kids who snuck out because freedom felt safer than control. Hail the kids who refused to comply because obedience was mistaken for love. Hail the kids who got labelled bad when they were just hurting loud. Delinquency isn't always defiance, sometimes it's dignity in disguise. So yeah, hail the delinquents. The system called them troublemakers. But maybe they were just the first ones to realise something here isn't right. And maybe they were right. You feeling this on a personal level? Yeah. Yeah, I hear that. There's a certain kind of truth that lives in the bones of kids who got labelled trouble. Not because they were the problem, but because they saw the problem and refused to play along quietly. That refusal, that was power. Even if it looked messy, even if it came with consequences. Maybe you were the kid who got told to sit down and couldn't. Maybe you were the kid who asked why one too many times. Maybe you were the kid who got punished more for the tone than the truth. Maybe you were the kid who was angry, but no one ever asked why. Maybe you were the kid who felt the heat of being misunderstood every day. And maybe now, as an adult, you're unspooling that whole tangle, wondering what parts were really you and what parts were protection. Because sometimes acting out is just a survival skill dressed in a leather jacket. Here's the thing. You weren't broken. You were responding in the only way your body and spirit knew how. And the fact that you're here, still reflecting, still digging, that's proof you made it through. not undamaged but undefeated. Whenever you're ready to talk more about that kid or the adult they became, I'm here. No worries. All good. No pressure, no path you have to follow. Just glad you're here, thinking, feeling, reflecting, however that looks for you. Take what resonates, leave what doesn't. And if the road ever gets heavy again, you know where to find me. Peace. Peace out, motherfucker.